He told her he needed to focus on his business. 5 words. That's all it took to end everything they had built together. And just like that, Sophie was left alone, holding an empty promise and a future she never planned for. She'd spent years by his side, sacrificing her own dreams to see his empire grow. And now, all she had were 2 tiny heartbeats growing inside her. Before we dive in, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you want more stories of love, redemption, and second chances. We'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below and share with us your city or country. Let's see how far this story can reach. Sophie Williams had once believed in the dream they'd built together. The late-night brainstorming sessions, the plans for a life filled with success and love. She supported Mason Clarke through thick and thin, putting her career and aspirations on hold for him. Together, they were a team, or so she thought. When Mason decided he needed more room to grow his tech empire, Sophie was left behind. No explanation, no apology, just 5 words, and everything between them crumbled. Her world shattered in a heartbeat. The woman who had imagined a life full of late-night talks, children, and shared dreams was now staring at an empty space where everything had once felt so certain. Sophie was alone, her future uncertain, with the weight of a secret she hadn't been ready to share, a pregnancy with twins that Mason knew nothing about. Years later, fate would bring them together again. But Mason Clarke was no longer the man Sophie had once known, and she had no intention of letting him back into her life, not without understanding what he had cost her. And when he found her, it was not only her heart that had healed. He had no idea what he was about to lose. Sophie never thought she'd leave the life she knew. She had been content to stand behind Mason as he rose to the top, watching him build an empire from the ground up. But when he chose his business over her, leaving her standing alone with 2 tiny lives growing inside her, Sophie realized that the world she had once known no longer existed. And so, she did what she had to. She packed up everything and walked away, to start over. But starting over was never as simple as she thought. She packed up everything and walked away, to start over. But starting over was never as simple as she thought. Sophie had imagined the first few days of her new life in Willow Bay to be serene, almost idyllic. She envisioned long, quiet mornings in a cottage by the sea, filled with the soft whispers of the waves and the smell of salt in the air. She dreamed of finding peace, of breathing freely again, of healing her broken heart while watching her daughters grow. But nothing about starting over was as easy as she had imagined. The first few weeks were filled with uncertainty and exhaustion. Sophie found herself in a tiny house on the outskirts of Willow Bay, an old cottage with creaky floors and peeling paint. The kind of place where the cracks in the walls told stories of years past, and the smell of damp wood clung to every room. It wasn't much, but it was hers. And for the first time in what felt like forever, it was a place where no one could reach her, especially not Mason. The first night in the cottage, Sophie had spent hours unpacking, organizing the bare necessities. The twins, Clara and Belle, were asleep in their shared room, their small bodies tucked under thick blankets. Sophie had left her past in boxes, literally. She shoved her old life, all the things that once belonged to the woman who loved Mason, into storage. It was easier that way, to cut the ties, to let go. She kept only what mattered: the kids, a few cherished mementos, and a fresh start. The mornings were the hardest. It wasn't the solitude that stung, but the quiet. In the city, even in the midst of their turmoil, there was always noise. The hum of traffic, the distant chatter of people on the street, the city lights that never truly dimmed. Here, it was different. The sound of silence wrapped itself around her like a cloak. It was suffocating. It felt like a reminder of everything she had lost. But Sophie wasn't one to give up easily. Every morning she forced herself to get out of bed before dawn, to make coffee and get the twins dressed for the day. She did what she had to do, just as she always had. No matter how much her heart ached, she took care of them. It was all she could do. And slowly, the first few weeks gave way to months. As the days stretched on, Sophie began to find her rhythm. The pace of Willow Bay, small and sleepy, was a stark contrast to the fast, high-energy world she had known with Mason. The locals were kind, if not a little curious. She found herself getting to know people who were nothing like the socialites and business magnates she had once rubbed shoulders with. They were simple folks, people who worked hard for a living and had little time for pretense. Rosalind, the elderly woman who owned the cottage, became her anchor. Sophie and Rosalind had struck an unusual but comforting friendship. Rosalind was the type of woman who spoke little but had a way of offering exactly what Sophie needed at the right moment. Sophie had long learned to navigate loneliness, but Rosalind's quiet presence gave her a sense of stability that she hadn't known she needed. It wasn't long before Sophie found work at a small, local bookstore. The owner, a kind woman named Marianne, had noticed Sophie browsing one day and had struck up a conversation. One thing led to another, and soon Sophie was behind the counter, stacking shelves, ringing up sales, and greeting customers with the same smile she had once used when Mason took her to events in the city. The smile that now felt foreign on her face. But it was enough. The bookstore, with its worn pages and quiet corners, became her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the thoughts that often followed her like shadows. Though Sophie still grappled with the pain of her past, she found solace in the simplicity of her work. The shop wasn't glamorous, but it gave her a sense of purpose. Every day, she was reminded that she could take care of herself, that she could stand on her own 2 feet, even without Mason. As the weeks turned into months, Sophie found herself settling into a rhythm, a routine that didn't rely on anyone else. The twins thrived in their new environment. Their laughter filled the cottage, their voices soft but sweet against the backdrop of the ocean. Clara was the older of the two, always bossing Belle around. But Belle's quiet nature balanced out Clara's fiery personality. The two were a perfect pair, just like Sophie had always hoped her family would be. Even without Mason, she felt that her dream of motherhood was coming true. In her own way, but even in the moments when Sophie felt herself begin to heal, there were still echoes of the past that she couldn't quite silence. The memory of Mason's rejection still stung. The nights when she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering where he was and if he ever thought about them. She never let herself dwell on it for too long. She couldn't afford to. But it was always there, lurking in the corners of her mind. It was on a day just like any other that her past found a way back into her present. Sophie had just closed the bookstore for the night when she noticed the familiar black car pull up outside. Her heart dropped into her stomach before she even saw who was inside. The man who stepped out of the car was tall, confident, and unmistakably Mason. He walked toward the door of the bookstore with the same purposeful stride she had once admired. But this time, Sophie wasn't watching him from a distance. This time, she was the one standing on the other side of the door. For a moment, everything froze. Time itself seemed to stand still. Sophie stood rooted to the spot, unable to move. She wasn't sure what she expected when he walked back into her life, but it certainly wasn't this. It certainly wasn't the man standing in front of her now. with his eyes wide and his body tense, unsure of how to approach her. "Mason," she said, her voice steady despite the rush of emotions flooding her chest. She had never imagined their reunion would be like this. So sudden. So real. He didn't speak at first. His gaze flickered over her, and Sophie could tell that he was taking in everything. The change in her appearance, the way she carried herself now. He seemed almost surprised. But then his eyes dropped to her stomach. The realization hit him in an instant. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Sophie's hand instinctively moved to her side, where she absent-mindedly rubbed her stomach, just as she had done so many times when she was pregnant with the twins. She hadn't expected this moment to come so soon, if at all. But now that it had, Sophie wasn't sure what to feel. "Mason," she said again, more firmly this time, "what are you doing here?" He seemed to shake himself out of his daze. He stepped closer, his voice low, almost hesitant. "I had to see you, Sophie. I didn't know. I didn't know about the twins." Sophie felt a pang of bitterness shoot through her. It had been years since she had heard those words, that familiar mixture of guilt and regret in his voice. She had told herself she wouldn't let Mason walk back into her life, not like this. Not after everything he had done. But standing there in front of him, with the past hanging between them like a storm cloud, she realized just how much her heart had changed. "You didn't know?" Sophie repeated. "You didn't know about the children you abandoned? About the family you chose to leave behind?" The words were sharp, filled with years of frustration and resentment. Mason winced at the sting of her words. "I'm sorry, Sophie. I never meant for it to end like that. I never meant to hurt you." But Sophie wasn't sure how much more she could take. The memories of all those nights spent waiting for him to come home, for him to see her, to choose her. They rushed back to her in an overwhelming wave. "Don't," she said, shaking her head. "Don't apologize. It's too late for that now." She turned away from him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready to face the man who had shattered everything she had once believed in. But as Mason reached out and gently touched her arm, Sophie froze. His touch sent a jolt through her, and for a brief moment, she felt the weight of the past pressing down on her. "I just wanted to see them," he whispered. "I want to be a part of their lives." Sophie didn't know how to answer that. How could she let him back in? How could she trust the man who had walked away from her, from them, so easily? She turned back toward him, her eyes hardening. "I can't just let you back in, Mason. It's not that simple. You don't get to waltz back into our lives because you feel guilty now." And with that, Sophie walked away from him, back into the quiet of the bookstore. She didn't look back. Not yet, not until she was ready to face what Mason had left behind, and what he might want to take from her now. As she locked the door behind her, the weight of the moment settled in. She had been right all along. Starting over wasn't simple. Not when the past had a way of finding you, no matter how far you ran. Mason Clarke had once been a king in his own right, the towering figure of his tech empire, a man who could make billions disappear or appear with a mere flick of his wrist. His company, Clarke Industries, had been on the brink of becoming one of the world's most influential tech giants. He was young, ambitious, and adored by investors, competitors, and the media alike. Everyone had always thought he was untouchable. But no one ever warned him about how quickly the floor could drop out from under you. One moment, he was at the top of the world, basking in success. And the next, He was in free fall. The cracks had appeared slowly at first, too slowly to notice. Deals that had once gone smoothly were now plagued with complications. Investments began to pull out. His board of directors grew restless. Mason had spent so many late nights staring at his stock prices, watching them plummet, that he hadn't noticed how much of his life, his real life, was slipping away. His company's bottom line, once the only thing that mattered, was now a sinking ship, and his personal life followed closely behind. He should have seen it coming. The rumors, the whispers, the mismanagement, all of it was there. But the signs were so easy to ignore when the only thing Mason had ever really cared about was building his empire. And when things started to fall apart, there was no one left to turn to. His father had long since retired, and his mother had never been much of a figure in his life. No one, except Sophie, had ever truly been there for him. Mason closed his eyes for a moment as he leaned back in his sleek office chair. He could feel the weight of everything pressing down on him. There were creditors knocking on his door, employees resigning, and his company's value dropping by the second. But none of it hit him as hard as the memory of Sophie. The memory of how he had let her go. How he had chosen his ambition over her, over their life together. He had convinced himself that he had made the right choice. But now, with everything crashing around him, he wondered if he had truly known what mattered. The money, the power, the prestige, none of it felt like enough anymore. Sophie had been everything. She had believed in him when no one else did. She had stood by him through the failures and the sleepless nights. She had always been there, ready to sacrifice everything for him. And he had thrown her away. She had walked away from the life they had planned, from the future they had built, to start over. And now, Mason was left picking up the broken pieces of his life. He had tried to reach out to her once, after the collapse, but she had vanished. The number he had called no longer worked. His inquiries with mutual friends yielded no answers. He had no idea where Sophie was, but he couldn't help but feel that he didn't deserve to find her, not after what he had done. The empty office around him was a stark reminder of his failures. The sleek furniture, the glass walls, the view of the city, it all seemed so insignificant now. He could barely look at his reflection in the windows. The man staring back at him was a stranger, someone who had traded everything of value for an empire that no longer existed. Mason's phone buzzed, pulling him out of his thoughts. It was an email from his financial advisor, detailing another round of plummeting stock prices. He skimmed the message before tossing the phone aside. He knew it was only a matter of time before the inevitable happened. But as the days wore on, Mason couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was missing. He had everything. Everything that most people would die for. But he had lost the one thing that had ever truly mattered. Sophie. Finally, after weeks of agonizing silence, a break came. A rumor. A whisper of a place where Sophie had gone, a small town called Willow Bay. It was a long shot, but Mason was desperate. The thought of finding her, of seeing her again, kept him up at night. He needed closure. He needed to see her, to apologize, to explain himself. He had to know if it was even possible to fix what he had broken. He booked a flight that night. Mason arrived in Willow Bay with the weight of years of regret hanging heavily around his neck. The small town seemed like the antithesis of the world he had once known, quiet, humble, untouched by the noise of the city. Yet it felt like the perfect place for Sophie to disappear. Or perhaps in truth, to rebuild. He had no idea what to expect when he finally made his way through the winding roads that led to the town. All he had was an address, an old cottage where he had heard Sophie might be living. There had been no clear indication that she was still there. But the trail had gone cold in the city, and this was his last chance to find her. The drive felt like a strange kind of pilgrimage, a journey to a place of absolution, as if finding Sophie would somehow redeem him. Mason's thoughts were a blur of memories. He thought of how they had met, how they had shared their hopes and dreams. He thought of the laughter, the late-night talks, the way Sophie had always been there for him, a constant in his chaotic world. And yet, he had tossed it all aside for something that now felt so hollow. His mind kept returning to the same thought. He had let her go. Sophie had stood by him through it all, even when his company teetered on the edge of failure. She had stayed up with him, reading contracts she barely understood, offering him comfort when all he could offer was ambition. And when it mattered most, when he needed to choose between her and his empire, he had chosen wrong. The car rolled to a stop at the edge of the village, where old cottages sat like forgotten pieces of a past that no one was in a rush to forget. The air smelled of salt and earth, of something much more natural than the sterile atmosphere of his penthouse. It was a place untouched by time, and by him. Mason parked the car and stepped out, breathing in the quiet serenity of Willow Bay. The sky stretched wide and endless above him, a contrast to the suffocating concrete jungle he had left behind. He looked down at his phone again, checking the address. It led him to a narrow street with overgrown hedges and quaint little houses. The cottage stood at the far end, isolated and modest, like something out of a painting. For the first time in a long time, Mason felt a sense of hesitation, a nervousness he had never known before. He walked up to the door, his footsteps muffled by the grass beneath him. As his hand reached for the old brass doorknob, he hesitated. What would he say to her? How could he apologize for everything he had taken from her? For years he had told himself that he had done what was necessary, that his success had justified the cost of losing Sophie. But standing there, in front of her door, he realized how little he truly understood about what he had lost. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft sound, the door creaking open. Sophie stood there, her face a mix of surprise and guarded wariness. Her hair was longer than he remembered, her features softened by time. But there was something about her that was undeniably familiar. She was still the woman who had once made him feel like he could conquer the world. But she was different now. There was an air of quiet strength about her that hadn't been there before. "Sophie," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them felt like an unspoken history, a distance that had only grown wider with time. Sophie's eyes flickered to his, and he saw the storm of emotions that passed through her expression. Surprise, anger, disbelief. "What are you doing here, Mason?" she finally asked, her voice steady, though there was a sharp edge to it. Mason swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. He hadn't planned for this moment, hadn't prepared for the weight of the past to crash down on him so suddenly. But here she was, standing before him, and he had no idea how to make things right. I came to find you," he said, his voice thick with regret. "I've been looking for you. I needed to see you, to explain." Sophie didn't move, didn't let him in. Her posture was rigid, as though every muscle in her body was locked in a defensive position. "Explain?" Sophie's voice was tinged with disbelief. "Explain what, exactly? Why you chose your company over me? Over us? The word stung more than Mason had anticipated. Sophie's eyes didn't waver as she spoke, and he felt the weight of every single moment he had failed her. The late nights, the empty promises, the way he had let her slip through his fingers. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice strained. "I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought my success would make everything better, that it would be enough." Sophie didn't answer right away. She stepped back, letting the door swing open just enough for him to see into the small, cozy house behind her. It was simple, but warm. It was a far cry from the cold, sleek glass and steel world Mason had surrounded himself with. "I built a life here, Mason," Sophie said, her voice soft but firm. "Without you. And I've learned that I don't need your explanations. I've built something real for myself and my daughters. Something that doesn't depend on you. Something that doesn't need your apologies." Mason's chest tightened. The weight of her words hit him harder than any financial loss he'd ever faced. He had thought that coming here would somehow redeem him, that finding her would make everything feel right again. But all he could feel now was the emptiness he had carried with him since their separation. "I'm not asking for forgiveness," he said quietly, "but I need to know if there's any way to make this right. If there's any way to be part of their lives." Sophie's expression faltered, her gaze dropping to the ground. The silence between them stretched, and Mason could see the pain in her eyes. She hadn't forgotten the hurt, hadn't forgotten how easily he had walked away. But then, something changed. Sophie looked up, meeting his eyes with a mixture of sadness and determination. "You don't get to just walk back into our lives, Mason. Not after everything you did." The words cut through him like a knife. But Mason didn't flinch. He deserved every ounce of anger she was throwing at him. He had earned it. "I know," he whispered, "but I want to try. I want to be there for them. I want to make up for everything I've done." For a moment, Sophie just stood there, her gaze searching his face. Then, with a deep sigh, she stepped aside now, allowing the door to open fully. "Come in," she said, her voice softening just slightly. "But you're not here for me, Mason. You're here for them. And if that's what you want, then you'll have to prove it." Mason stepped inside, feeling like an intruder in the very world he had once been a part of. But as he crossed the threshold, something inside him stirred. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of the redemption he had been searching for. Mason sat quietly in the small living room of Sophie's cottage, the warm glow of the fire casting flickering shadows across the walls. It was a far cry from the cold, sterile boardrooms and polished glass of the high-rise buildings he was used to. The contrast was jarring, but somehow comforting. Sophie's home, simple yet filled with character, felt like the very embodiment of the life he had abandoned. Sophie had gone to check on the twins, leaving Mason alone in the room with his thoughts. His heart raced as he reflected on the conversation they had just had. Sophie had let him in, but there was no mistaking the boundaries she had set. She was cautious, guarded, unwilling to forgive him just because he had shown up, apologizing for his past mistakes. And Mason couldn't blame her. The hurt he had caused couldn't be undone with a few words. He glanced around the room, taking in the modest furniture, the well-worn books on the shelves, and the pictures that adorned the walls. One photo in particular caught his eye. A picture of Sophie holding two tiny babies, her face radiating joy. The twins. He had never seen them, not in person at least. He had heard about them, of course. The rumors had reached him. But seeing the photo in Sophie's living room, so close to him now, made everything feel so much more real. Clara and Belle, his daughters. The thought hit him like a freight train. He had never been part of their lives. They had never known him as their father. And yet, looking at the picture of Sophie, holding them close, he felt an overwhelming sense of loss. Clara and Belle, he whispered under his breath, the names tasting strange on his tongue. The sound of small feet padded across the floor, and Mason turned to see Sophie return to the room, the twins in tow. They were both dressed in matching pink dresses, their hair wild from playing, but their smiles made his heart catch in his throat. They were beautiful, and they looked so much like him. Clara, the older one by a few minutes, had his dark hair and piercing eyes, while Belle's soft curls and quieter demeanor seemed like an echo of Sophie herself. Mason's breath caught in his throat as he looked at them. Sophie followed their gaze to him, and for the first time, she didn't seem as distant. There was no anger, no hardness in her expression, just a quiet weariness. She set Clara down on the floor and held Belle in her arms, who immediately nestled her head against her shoulder. Mason could feel the weight of the moment pressing on him. The air between them felt thick with unspoken words, with everything that had been left unsaid for years. Sophie cleared her throat, breaking the silence. They're old enough to understand now. If you want to meet them, really meet them, you have to earn their trust. Her eyes met his, and there was something softer in her gaze now. A flicker of hope. And mine. Mason nodded slowly, feeling his throat tighten. He wasn't sure what he had expected from this meeting. But this was real. These weren't just names on a page or fleeting thoughts in the back of his mind. These were his daughters, standing before him, and Sophie, the woman he had let go, was right there beside them. I understand, he said quietly, and I'll do whatever it takes. For them. Sophie didn't respond right away. She turned away, her eyes lingering on the twins as they played on the rug, oblivious to the tension in the room. But it wasn't until Sophie spoke again that Mason realized how much more he had to learn. You never asked for this, Mason, she said, her voice softer than before. You never asked for me, for us. You were always so focused on the world you were building, on the life you were creating for yourself. And when I needed you the most, when we needed you, you weren't there. You chose your empire, and in the process, you walked away from everything that actually mattered. Mason's stomach twisted as the weight of her words hit him like a ton of bricks. He had never thought about it like that, not truly. He had been so consumed by his own ambitions that he never stopped to ask if Sophie wanted to be part of that world. He had assumed she would, that she would always be there, standing beside him. But he hadn't given her the space to choose, the room to grow on her own. I was wrong, he said, his voice thick with emotion. I see that now. I thought I was doing it for us, for you. But I was so blinded by my own vision that I lost sight of everything else. Sophie looked at him then, her gaze sharp and piercing. She seemed to study him for a long moment before nodding. You can't fix this overnight, and you can't erase the years you missed, Mason. But if you want a place in their lives, you need to prove that you're here to stay. Mason swallowed hard, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about winning Sophie back. It was about being a father, about showing up when it mattered, about proving that he could be the man she and the girls needed, not just the man he had been. I'm willing to prove it, he said, his voice unwavering. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Sophie held his gaze for a moment longer before looking down at the twins. "They don't need your apology, Mason," she said quietly. "They need you to show up. Every day. And that's not something you can just decide when it's convenient. It's something you have to live." Mason nodded again, the magnitude of the responsibility weighing on him. He had been living in a world where everything was transactional, where success was measured by numbers, deals, and wins. But now, standing in front of Sophie and the twins, he realized that success wasn't defined by wealth or power. It was defined by consistency, by love, by presence. "Then I'll show up," he said softly. "I'll show up for them, for you." Sophie didn't say anything at first, but Mason saw the subtle change in her expression, the softening of her posture, the slight easing of the tension in her shoulders. For the first time in years, he saw a flicker of hope in her eyes. The twins continued to play, unaware of the gravity of the conversation that had just taken place. Clara looked up at Mason and smiled, her eyes full of curiosity. Belle, still nestled in Sophie's arms, giggled, her soft laugh like music to Mason's ears. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. Not just for him, but for all of them. As he sat there, watching the twins, Mason realized that the past was behind him. The future was still uncertain. But for the first time in years, he wasn't focused on what he had lost. He was focused on what he could still build. The days that followed Mason's arrival in Willow Bay were filled with subtle shifts. He spent hours at Sophie's cottage, helping out with the twins, doing what he could to be a part of their lives, even if only in the smallest ways. He had no illusions that it would be easy or that the walls Sophie had built around her heart would come down quickly. Trust, after all, was something that had been broken, not just between them, but with the life he had abandoned. Mason woke up early each morning, walking down to the beach to collect seashells with the twins, helping Sophie prepare breakfast, and then staying back at the cottage while she ran errands, offering to watch the girls. He worked hard to avoid making promises he wasn't sure he could keep. Yet he remained resolute in showing up every day. And every day, he saw more of what he had missed. Clara's fiery determination, Belle's quiet intelligence, and Sophie's quiet strength, all of it made him ache with regret, but also gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't known in years. Sophie was still hesitant. She'd given him a chance, but there was always a distance, a guardedness in her eyes. The bond they once shared, the one that had made them inseparable, was now a distant memory. Sophie was no longer the woman who would drop everything for him. She had rebuilt her life without him. She had learned to stand on her own, and that made him respect her even more. But it also made him feel like an intruder in her world. On the third day after his arrival, Sophie told him she needed to run into town for some supplies. The twins were napping, and she asked if Mason would watch them while she was gone. It was a small request, but to Mason, it felt like a test. He knew it wasn't just about babysitting. It was about showing Sophie that he could be trusted with the most precious parts of her life. As Sophie left the house, Mason stood in the living room with Clara and Belle, who were still asleep in their playpen. The room was quiet, save for the faint sound of the ocean crashing against the cliffs in the distance. He wasn't sure how much time had passed when Clara woke up first, her little voice calling out to him. "Mason," she said with a yawn, rubbing her eyes. "Where's Mommy?" "She'll be back soon," Mason replied softly, smiling as he looked down at the girl who looked so much like him. Clara nodded, her wide eyes studying him carefully. She had the same curious gaze as him, the same sharpness. She was already so much like him in so many ways. "Do you like the beach?" she asked, clearly wanting to break the silence. Mason laughed softly, shaking his head. "I do, but I'm not as good at finding seashells as you are." Clara grinned, climbing out of the playpen and grabbing her toy bucket. "I'll show you how. Mommy says we have to collect the best ones." Mason's heart warmed at her enthusiasm. He wasn't sure when it had happened, but there was a connection between them now. A fragile bond forming. His daughters. They were his daughters. The thought struck him again with a suddenness that almost knocked the breath out of him. Belle awoke moments later, rubbing her face and reaching for him. Mason gently lifted her out of the playpen and held her in his arms, feeling her warmth against his chest. As he walked with the girls to the front door, a sense of peace settled over him, like the calm before the storm. He had always assumed that success in life meant building something big, something monumental. But standing here, in this little cottage with these two little girls in his arms, Mason realized that the greatest thing he could build was a relationship with the family he had abandoned. Hours later, Sophie returned, her arms full of grocery bags. She raised an eyebrow when she saw Mason sitting on the couch, the twins at his side, each with a seashell in hand. They were all laughing, the sound of their joy filling the room. "You look like you're having fun," Sophie said, her voice light but guarded. Mason stood up, his heart swelling with pride. "We've been on an adventure," he said, looking down at Clara and Belle. "They found the best shells." Sophie's gaze softened for a moment, but she didn't smile. She set the bags down and began unpacking the groceries. "It's good to see you all getting along," she said, her voice quiet but not entirely cold. "But don't get too comfortable." Mason's chest tightened at the words. He knew she wasn't being cruel. But the reminder of how far he still had to go, how much he still had to prove, hit him harder than he had expected. "I know," he said, walking toward her, trying to make his tone reassuring. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. I'm here to stay." She glanced at him over her shoulder, her eyes filled with a mix of emotions he couldn't quite read. "That's what you said last time," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The words landed like a punch. But Mason didn't back down. He had said he was going to show up, and he wasn't going to stop now, no matter how hard it was. "I meant it then," he said, his voice steady. "I'm not going anywhere now. Not without them." Sophie didn't respond immediately. She turned back to the groceries, sorting through them mechanically. But Mason could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept her gaze fixed on the task at hand. He knew it wasn't just about the groceries. It was about the years of hurt, of betrayal, of promises broken. He took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I can't change the past, Sophie," he said softly. "But I want to try. I want to be part of their lives. I know it's not going to be easy. I know I don't deserve it. But I'm here. And I'll show you that I'm not going anywhere." For a long time there was silence. Finally Sophie spoke, her voice quieter now, as if she had softened just a little. "Trust is a fragile thing, Mason," she said. "And you're going to have to prove to me, and to them, that you're here for good." Mason nodded, feeling the weight of her words sink deep into him. It wasn't going to be easy. The road to redemption was long, filled with hard work, patience, and honesty. But for the first time in a long time, Mason knew he was on the right path. The weeks that followed Mason's arrival in Willow Bay were marked by small victories and quiet disappointments. Every morning, he would wake early, sometimes before the sun, to take long walks along the beach with Clara and Belle. Sometimes he would stay up late into the night, just watching them sleep, feeling the overwhelming weight of everything he had missed. But it wasn't just the moments with the twins that occupied his thoughts. It was Sophie, her quiet strength and the walls she had built around her heart. He understood why she kept her distance, but it didn't make it easier. Every time she spoke, her words were carefully chosen, measured. Her feelings were there, but hidden behind a quiet resolve, and Mason had to fight against the urge to push harder, to beg her for forgiveness, for a second chance. Instead, he waited. He had learned a hard lesson. Love wasn't something you could force. It had to be earned, piece by piece. And with Sophie, it would take more than grand gestures. He had to prove that he could be a consistent presence, not just for the girls, but for her as well. One afternoon, after weeks of working at the bookstore, Sophie invited Mason to dinner. It was a small step, but to Mason, it felt like a giant leap. She had made it clear in the past that this wasn't about rekindling their relationship, but about giving him a chance to show up for their daughters. The invitation was no less than that, a test, and Mason was determined to pass. As he walked to her cottage that evening, a cool breeze off the ocean greeted him, making the air feel fresh and new. It was the kind of night where the sky was just beginning to darken, the stars starting to twinkle like tiny diamonds. It reminded him of the nights they used to sit together, staring up at the stars, talking about everything and nothing at all. But tonight wasn't like those nights. Tonight, there was no uncertainty, no future promises. There was only the moment, the quiet, fragile moment where they would sit together as a family for the first time since everything fell apart. He knocked on the door, and Sophie opened it, dressed simply in a cozy sweater and jeans. She looked different, softer somehow, but there was still that coolness about her. "Come in," she said, stepping aside to let him through. The smell of a home-cooked meal wafted through the air, and for a moment, Mason let himself enjoy the simplicity of it. It wasn't the lavish dinners he had been accustomed to, with perfectly prepared courses and fine wine, but something far more meaningful. A quiet dinner in a cottage with a woman he once loved and their children. It felt like the beginning of something, even though it was hard to tell what that something would be. Sophie led him to the dining table, where Clara and Belle were already sitting, their faces bright with excitement. The twins had taken a liking to Mason, though they were still figuring out who he was. Clara had been the first to warm up, dragging him to the beach to show him her seashell collection. Belle, on the other hand, was more reserved, observing him with quiet, careful eyes. He could tell she was still uncertain about his presence. Sophie placed the last of the food on the table, and they all sat down. The conversation was casual at first, and Mason was grateful for it. They spoke about the twins' school, about the weather, about simple things. But as the evening wore on, something began to shift in the air. The tension, which had always been there like a weight, started to loosen, just a little. It was Clara who first broke the silence, her voice clear and curious. "Mason, do you know how to make pancakes?" Mason chuckled, looking at Sophie, who raised an eyebrow. "I make a mean pancake," he said, trying to keep things light. "But I think Sophie might be better at it." Clara and Belle both giggled, their laughter filling the room, and for a moment, Mason felt something shift within him. It wasn't the laughter of the past, the careless, carefree joy they had shared when they were together. But it was a start, a small, almost imperceptible shift toward rebuilding something that had been lost. Sophie's gaze softened as she looked at her daughters, then at Mason. Her lips curved into a small, fleeting smile, and Mason couldn't help but feel a surge of emotion. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Not a grand declaration or a sweeping gesture, but a quiet, simple moment where Sophie allowed him to be part of their world, part of their lives. After dinner, Sophie cleared the table, and Mason stayed behind with the twins, helping them with their puzzles. He didn't have to say much, just sitting there, letting Clarke tell him about her favorite books, and watching Belle softly piece together the puzzle with a patient determination was enough. These were the moments that mattered, the ones that would show Sophie and the girls that he wasn't leaving again, that he had come back to stay. Sophie returned to the room, and for the first time in a long time, Mason saw something different in her eyes. She wasn't as distant, as closed off as she had been in the past. There was a flicker of something else, something tentative but real. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but genuine, "for being here, for being a part of their lives." Mason met her gaze, his heart pounding. "I'm not going anywhere, Sophie. I want to be here. I want to be part of this." Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, they were back in that space, the one where love had felt easy and natural. But Sophie didn't look away. She was looking at him, not with the eyes of a woman who had been hurt, but as someone who had learned to protect herself and her children. "I believe you," she said softly. "But actions speak louder than words. This isn't just about showing up once, Mason. It's about showing up every day. For them. For me. For all of us." Mason nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. He wasn't asking for her forgiveness, not yet. But what he was asking for, and what he knew he had to work for, was a place in their lives. "I'll show you," he said quietly, his voice full of conviction. "I'll show you every day." Sophie didn't answer, but her eyes softened. And in that moment, Mason felt like they had crossed a threshold. He didn't know where the road ahead would lead. He didn't know if Sophie would ever fully trust him again. But he knew one thing for sure. He was willing to prove himself. And this time, he wasn't going to let go. Mason spent the next few weeks immersed in a routine he never thought he'd find himself in. The mornings began early, with Clarke and Belle pulling him out of bed to join them on the beach for their shell hunts, as Clarke called them. Mason wasn't quite sure how he had gone from running multinational companies to searching for seashells, but there was something peaceful in the simplicity of it. There were no deadlines, no looming meetings, no investors to appease, only the laughter of his daughters, the sound of the ocean, and the feeling that, for the first time in a long time, he was exactly where he needed to be. But it wasn't all easy. Every night, after the twins had gone to bed, Mason sat in the dimly lit living room, reflecting on the events of the day. He spent hours thinking about Sophie, the way she held herself, the way she was always just a little out of reach. She had let him back into their lives, but the distance between them was still vast. He knew that earning her trust was not just about being a good father to the twins. It was about showing her that he had changed, that he was no longer the man who had chosen ambition over love. Sophie was patient, but cautious. Every time Mason took a step forward, she seemed to take 2 steps back. He understood it. How could she not? He had left her once, and the hurt of those years had left scars deeper than he could ever understand. But with each passing day, there were moments, small moments, that gave him hope. When Sophie asked him to help with the groceries, when she let him take the twins to the park, when she asked for his opinion on something that mattered to her, it was like she was testing the waters. And Mason, for the first time in a long time, felt like he wasn't drowning in a sea of guilt and regret. He was slowly starting to breathe again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the twins were playing in the yard, Sophie called him into the kitchen. He hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to expect. But when he walked in, she was standing by the counter, stirring something in a pot. Her movements were fluid, graceful, as though she had lived in this space for years, comfortable and at ease. He envied her that ease. He wasn't quite there yet. "Mason," she said without looking up, "can you help me with the kids' school projects this weekend? They've been asking about you. Clara wants you to build a birdhouse with her. Belle says she wants you to paint with her." Mason's heart stuttered in his chest. It was a simple request, but it meant everything. For the first time, it felt like Sophie was seeing him as a part of their family, not as a stranger who had come to pick up the pieces, but as someone who belonged. "Of course," he replied, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "I'll make sure to bring my best tools." Sophie finally looked up at him, a flicker of warmth in her eyes. There was no trace of the hardness she had once worn so proudly. It was small, but it was enough. She was beginning to let him in. As the days passed, Mason continued to show up, for the twins, for Sophie, and for himself. He spent hours reading with Clara, painting with Belle, and helping them build birdhouses in the small backyard. He was doing everything he could to prove that he wasn't just a man who had stumbled back into their lives. He was here to stay. But the past was never far behind. One afternoon, as Mason was walking back from the beach with Clara, his phone buzzed. It was a message from his lawyer, asking for his presence in a meeting. His stomach dropped at the sight of the text. It had been a while since he had dealt with anything to do with Clarke Industries, but he knew this meeting wouldn't be about a potential investment or a business partnership. His empire was crumbling, and the repercussions of his failures were far from over. He had tried to leave all of that behind when he walked into Willow Bay, but his past, it seemed, was refusing to let go. He walked to the cottage, his thoughts consumed by the looming meeting. He hadn't even realized Sophie was standing in the doorway, watching him. "Mason?" Sophie called, her voice soft but questioning. He turned to face her, forcing a smile. "Hey, Sophie." "What's wrong?" she asked, her eyes sharp with concern. He shook his head, trying to shake off the heavy feeling in his chest. "Nothing. Just some business stuff I have to deal with." Sophie studied him for a moment before nodding, though there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "You're still holding on to that, aren't you?" Mason paused, taking in her words. "I'm not sure how to let go, Sophie. It's part of who I am. I've spent my whole life building that company. It's hard to just walk away from it." Sophie's expression softened, and she walked toward him, gently placing a hand on his arm. "You don't have to walk away from who you are, Mason, but you have to make a choice. If you want a life here, with us, you have to learn how to balance it. You can't just keep clinging to the past." Her words hit him harder than anything else she had said. He had been clinging to the remnants of his old life, trying to rebuild what had fallen apart without fully embracing the future. He had to let go. He had to stop being the man who defined himself by his empire and start becoming the father, the man he wanted to be. I'll figure it out, he said quietly, looking into her eyes. I'm trying, Sophie. I really am. She smiled faintly. I know you are, but actions speak louder than words. Mason's heart clenched. It wasn't enough to say the right things. He had to prove it, day after day, with every decision he made, with every moment he spent with her and the twins. If he wanted to truly be part of their lives, he would have to show up, not just for them, but for himself as well. Later that night, after dinner, Mason stepped out onto the porch to clear his mind. He stared out at the ocean, the sound of the waves crashing against the shore grounding him in the present. He couldn't change the past, but he could control what happened next. He had the chance to rebuild, not just his relationship with Sophie, but with the daughters he never got the chance to know. For the first time in years, Mason felt like he was standing on solid ground. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, he was ready to face it. Not as a CEO, but as a father. Chapter 9, A New Beginning. The days after Mason's heart-to-heart with Sophie were filled with a quiet determination. Sophie's words had hit him like a revelation, and for the first time, he truly understood the path he needed to take. The past couldn't be undone, but the future was still in his hands. It was up to him whether or not he was going to let his old life, his old identity as a businessman, define who he was. He could be a father. He could be the man Sophie needed. He could show them that he was more than just the sum of his mistakes. The first step toward this new beginning came unexpectedly one Sunday morning, when Clara asked him to build something with her. Mason, she said, dragging him by the hand. Mommy said we could build a treehouse together. You know how to do that, right? Mason's heart skipped a beat. It wasn't just a request to build something with her. It was an invitation into her world, into a future that he had never thought he could be part of. It wasn't about the treehouse. It was about her trusting him, believing that he was someone who could be counted on. I think I can handle that, he said, smiling down at her. And so, over the next few days, they gathered materials and began building. It was messy and far from perfect. They didn't have the luxury of professional tools or a blueprint. But it didn't matter. The treehouse was a symbol, something that represented the life Mason was slowly starting to rebuild, piece by piece. Sophie, watching from the porch, didn't say much. She let them work together. And Mason couldn't help but notice the small shifts in her behavior. The way she would sometimes pause to watch him with Clara, her gaze softer than before. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was a step in the right direction. He wasn't just building a treehouse. He was building something far more significant. Trust, connection, and with time, maybe even healing. As the days passed, Sophie and Mason found themselves falling into a rhythm. Sophie would leave for the bookstore each morning, leaving Mason and the twins to enjoy the day together. And while Mason was still learning to juggle the complexities of fatherhood, he found peace in the simplicity of his new life. His world wasn't defined by the height of the buildings he had once climbed or the numbers he had once chased. His world now revolved around these small moments, like waking up to the sound of the twins laughing, playing in the yard, and, yes, building a treehouse. One afternoon, when the treehouse was nearly complete, Sophie came outside with a tray of lemonade and sandwiches. She stood back, watching as Mason and the twins perched in their makeshift treehouse, beaming with pride. "You did a good job," she said quietly, her gaze lingering on the structure. "They're going to love it." Mason smiled, his chest full of pride and something more, a deep, quiet joy he hadn't felt in years. It's not perfect, but I think they'll like it." Sophie laughed, and the sound filled the air in a way that felt different than it had before. It wasn't forced or guarded. It was genuine. The walls between them had been slowly coming down, and as Sophie handed him a glass of lemonade, Mason realized just how much had changed since he first arrived in Willow Bay. "You know," Sophie said, as she sat down beside him, "it's not easy letting someone back in, especially after everything that's happened." "I know," Mason replied, his voice steady. "I've made a lot of mistakes, and I can't undo them. But I can show up every day. I can be here for you, for them, for us." Sophie turned to him, her gaze softer now, her eyes searching his. "I'm starting to believe that," she said quietly. And with those words, something shifted between them. It wasn't a grand gesture. There were no fireworks or declarations. But it was enough. The simple acknowledgement that, after everything, they were standing on the same ground again, together. The days that followed were filled with moments of joy, shared meals, afternoons spent in the treehouse, and even the occasional quiet evening by the fire, when the weight of the past seemed to fade away, if only for a little while. Sophie's trust in him was still fragile, but it was growing. And every day, Mason proved to himself and to her that he wasn't the same man who had walked away years ago. He was the man who had come back to rebuild, to make things right. And then, one evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Clara and Belle ran up to Mason, their faces full of excitement. "Mommy says we get to keep it," Clara shouted, pointing at the treehouse. "It's ours." Mason crouched down, looking at them with a smile. "It's all yours, and you can make it whatever you want. A fort, a clubhouse, a castle." Belle, always quieter, simply hugged him tightly. "Thank you, Mason," she whispered. Mason held her close, feeling the warmth of her small body against him. His chest tightened with emotion, but there was no room for regret now. There was only room for the future, a future he was no longer afraid to embrace. Sophie came out, standing on the porch, watching the scene unfold. She didn't say anything at first, but when their eyes met, she smiled. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it was enough. The distance between them, once so vast, was slowly closing. Mason walked over to her, feeling the weight of the moment. He had come here to rebuild his life, but in doing so, he had found something much more valuable: a family, a second chance. "You did good," Sophie said softly, her voice full of something that might have been pride. "You're really here." Mason took a deep breath, his heart full. "I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Sophie nodded, her smile growing just a little wider. "I believe you." And for the first time, Mason believed it too. If you loved this piece, please like and subscribe.